It was the second week of April 1902, and the coastal town of Cypress Point, California, was experiencing an unseasonable warmth that drew visitors from San Francisco, seeking respite from the city's persistent fog. The Southern Pacific Railroad had extended its line to the town just 3 years prior, transforming what had been a quiet fishing village into a modest resort destination for those who could afford the $12 fare and the leisure time to enjoy the rocky shores and towering redwoods that defined this stretch of the Monterey Peninsula. Margaret Ashworth, a 28-year-old schoolteacher from Boston, had arrived on April 8th, stepping off the afternoon train with a single leather trunk and a canvas satchel containing her watercolors and journals. She had written to her mother that the journey west was part of her recovery from a bout of pneumonia that had kept her bedridden through the harsh New England winter. Her physician had recommended sea air and sunshine, and a former colleague teaching in Sacramento had suggested Cypress Point as an ideal destination, quiet, scenic, and considerably less expensive than the established resorts in Santa Barbara or Coronado. Margaret had taken a room at the Seafoam Inn, a 3-story Victorian establishment run by a widow named Eleanor Hartley, who would later testify that Miss Ashworth had been the ideal guest, punctual, courteous, and devoted to her daily routine of morning walks along the cliffs, afternoon painting sessions in the garden, and evening readings in the parlor. She had paid for 2 weeks in advance, signing the register in careful cursive and listing her permanent address as 47 Beacon Street, Boston, Massachusetts. The last confirmed sighting of Margaret Ashworth was on the morning of April 14, 1902. Thomas Brennan, the lighthouse keeper at Cypress Point, observed her walking along the coastal trail that wound between the lighthouse and Seal Cove, a distance of approximately 2 miles. She wore a navy blue walking dress and carried her painting supplies in a wicker basket. Brennan noted the time in his log, 8:47 a.m., because he had just finished recording the weather conditions: clear skies, mild wind from the northwest, sea state calm. He would later tell investigators that she had waved to him as she passed, and he had tipped his cap in return, thinking nothing unusual about another tourist enjoying the spectacular morning light that made the Pacific shimmer like hammered silver. When Margaret failed to appear for supper that evening, Mrs. Hartley assumed she had perhaps accepted an invitation from one of the other guests or ventured into the village for a meal. But when her room remained empty through the night, and she missed breakfast the following morning, the innkeeper grew concerned. She sent her handyman, a Portuguese immigrant named Joseph Silva, to check the usual spots where tourists gathered: the beach, the Mission Gardens, the shops along Ocean Avenue. He found no trace of her. By noon on April 15th, Mrs. Hartley had notified the county sheriff's office in Monterey. Deputy Samuel McKinley arrived that evening, having made the journey on horseback along the winding coast road. He was a methodical man who had served as a cavalry officer in the Spanish-American War before taking up law enforcement, and he approached Margaret's disappearance with military precision. He interviewed every guest at the Seafoam Inn, cataloged the contents of her room, and organized search parties to comb the coastline and surrounding forest. Margaret's room revealed a life interrupted mid-sentence. Her journal lay open on the writing desk, the final entry dated April 14th morning. The light here is extraordinary, unlike anything in New England. It has a quality of gold mixed with salt air that I'm trying to capture in my paintings. Today, I will attempt the cypress trees near the point. Mrs. H. has packed me a lunch. The sentence ended there, the pen still resting in the crease of the journal, a small pool of dried ink marking where she had set it down. The search efforts expanded over the following week. Volunteers from Cypress Point, Monterey, and even Salinas joined the effort. They walked the beaches at low tide, searching the sea caves and tidal pools. They traced every trail through the Del Monte forest, calling Margaret's name until their voices grew hoarse. Fishermen were enlisted to search the waters near the rocky points, where someone might have fallen, or been swept out by a rogue wave. The Southern Pacific Railroad distributed her description to all stations between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and newspapers as far away as Sacramento ran stories about the missing Boston schoolteacher. Margaret's mother, Catherine Ashworth, arrived from Boston on April 28th, having made the transcontinental journey in record time. She was a formidable woman who had raised 3 daughters alone after her husband's death in a factory accident, and she refused to accept the growing consensus that Margaret had likely been claimed by the sea. She hired private investigators, offered a reward of $500, a substantial sum in 1902, and personally walked every path her daughter might have taken, studying the landscape with the fierce attention of a mother who refused to give up hope. But as days turned to weeks and spring gave way to summer, even Catherine Ashworth was forced to confront the probability that her daughter was gone. The case file was transferred from active investigation to unsolved disappearance. Deputy McKinley submitted his final report on June 1, 1902, concluding that Margaret Ashworth had most likely suffered an accident while painting near the cliffs, though he noted several troubling details. No painting supplies had been recovered. No witnesses had seen her near particularly dangerous areas. And despite extensive searching, no body had washed ashore. Unusual given the current patterns that typically returned victims to land within days. For over a century, Margaret Ashworth's disappearance remained one of California's oldest unsolved missing person cases, a footnote in the early history of Cypress Point, occasionally mentioned in books about mysterious disappearances or featured in anniversary articles in the local newspaper. Her name was etched on a memorial plaque in the town cemetery, placed there by her mother before she returned to Boston, never to visit California again. Then on March 3, 2019, construction workers excavating for a new hotel development on the outskirts of Cypress Point made a discovery that would crack open a case everyone had assumed would never be solved. The excavator's bucket had struck something solid in what should have been sandy soil. The operator, Rick Valdez, stopped the machine and climbed down to investigate. At first, he thought it might be an old septic tank or foundation from one of the original homesteads that had dotted this area before development. But as he cleared away the dirt with his hands, he found wooden planks, carefully fitted together, covering what appeared to be a stone-lined pit. His foreman, Danny Chen, made the call to stop work immediately and contact the authorities. The Monterey County Sheriff's Office responded within an hour. Detective Maria Santos, who headed the cold case unit, arrived with a forensic team. She had been with the department for 18 years and had developed a reputation for meticulous investigation of historical cases. As the team carefully removed the wooden planking, they revealed a chamber approximately 6 feet deep and 4 feet square, its walls lined with mortared fieldstone. At the bottom wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth, were human remains. The recovery took 3 days. Every layer was photographed, documented, and preserved. Along with the skeletal remains, the team found several items that had survived the century of interment. Buttons made of mother-of-pearl, a small gold locket on a delicate chain, the metal stays from a corset, and leather fragments that might have been from boots. Most significantly, they found a small brass plate, green with verdigris, but still legible when carefully cleaned. M.A. Boston. Detective Santos knew immediately what they might have found. She had familiarized herself with all of the county's historical missing person cases, and Margaret Ashworth's was among the most well-documented. She requested the case file from the county archives and found Deputy McKinley's detailed notes, including a description of a locket Margaret had worn, a gift from her late father containing a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. The forensic anthropologist confirmed the remains were female, aged 25 to 35 at time of death, approximately 5.4 in height, consistent with Margaret Ashworth's description. DNA extraction would be attempted, though the age of the remains made success uncertain. But Santos didn't wait for those results. She began investigating the land where the body had been found. Property records showed the plot had changed hands numerous times over the decades. In 1902, it had been part of a 40-acre parcel owned by a man named Josiah Blackwood, who operated a small dairy farm and supplied milk to the hotels and inns in Cypress Point. Santos found his name in Deputy McKinley's notes. He had been among the volunteers who searched for Margaret, and he had provided horses and wagons for the search parties. Santos dug deeper into Blackwood's history. Census records showed he had arrived in California from Illinois in 1898, claiming to be a widower. He had purchased the land with what he told locals was an inheritance from his late wife's family. He was described in contemporary accounts as industrious and respectable, active in the Methodist Church, and generous with his resources. He had never remarried, living alone on his farm until his death in 1934. But as Santos traced backward, she found discrepancies. There was no record of Josiah Blackwood in Illinois before 1895. No marriage certificate for his supposed late wife. No documentation of the inheritance he claimed. The man seemed to have materialized from nowhere, fully formed with a tragic backstory and enough money to buy prime California farmland. She contacted genealogist Dr. Michael Torres at UC Santa Cruz, who specialized in tracking historical identities. Together, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. A man matching Blackwood's description, approximately 35 years old, dark hair, distinctive scar on his left hand, had been connected to disappearances in 3 other locations before arriving in California. In 1891, a young woman had vanished from a boarding house in Kansas City where a John Black had been residing. In 1894, a female telegraph operator disappeared from Cheyenne, Wyoming, shortly after a Joseph Woodward arrived in town. In 1897, a nurse went missing from a hospital in Reno, where a Josiah Woods had been working as an orderly. The pattern was clear to modern eyes trained in serial predator behavior, but in an era before centralized law enforcement databases, before fingerprinting was widely used, before even basic information sharing between jurisdictions, a man could simply change his name and move on, leaving only questions in his wake. Santos needed more concrete evidence connecting Blackwood to Margaret Ashworth's death. She returned to the archives, this time focusing on the days immediately following Margaret's disappearance. In the Cypress Point Gazette, she found a small item dated April 17, 1902. Mr. J. Blackwood has taken ill with a severe grippal infection and will be unable to continue assisting in the search for the missing Boston lady. Reverend Polk requests prayers for his swift recovery. The timing was suspicious. Santos cross-referenced this with McKinley's search records. Blackwood had volunteered on April 15th and 16th, then abruptly withdrew. His illness excuse had never been questioned. Influenza outbreaks were common, and his prior helpfulness placed him above suspicion. Santos obtained permission to search the remaining structures from Blackwood's farm. Only one building survived, a small barn that had been converted to equipment storage by subsequent owners. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team discovered an anomaly beneath the barn's floor, another stone-lined chamber, similar to the one where Margaret had been found. This chamber was empty of human remains, but forensic analysis revealed traces of lime and organic material, consistent with decomposition. On one of the stones, barely visible, someone had scratched letters EM 1891 and AR 1894 and CN 1897. If these were initials and dates, they corresponded exactly with the disappearances Santos had linked to Blackwood's aliases. The investigation now expanded beyond California. Santos coordinated with cold case units in Missouri, Wyoming, and Nevada. In Kansas City, records showed that the missing woman from 1891 was Emma Morrison, a 26-year-old seamstress. In Cheyenne, it was Alice Reardon, 24, the telegraph operator. In Reno, Catherine Norris, 29, the nurse. All were single women, educated, working in respectable professions. All had been far from their families, making their disappearances easier to overlook or dismiss. Meanwhile, the DNA analysis of Margaret Ashworth's remains had yielded a partial profile. Santos tracked down Margaret's great-great-niece, Sarah Ashworth Collins, living in Philadelphia. She agreed to provide a DNA sample, and the mitochondrial DNA comparison confirmed the identification. After 117 years, Margaret Ashworth had been found. But the case presented an unusual challenge. The perpetrator had been dead for 85 years. There would be no arrest, no trial, no traditional justice. Yet Santos felt compelled to complete the investigation, to give names to the initials carved in stone, to provide whatever closure was possible to descendant families who might not even know their ancestors had been murdered. She discovered that Josiah Blackwood had living descendants, a great-grandson named Robert Blackwood, 67, who lived in San Jose and worked as a retired software engineer. When Santos contacted him, Robert was initially skeptical, then horrified as she presented the evidence. He had grown up hearing stories about his great-grandfather, the respectable farmer who had helped build Cypress Point's early infrastructure. His father had inherited a small sum from the sale of the farm in the 1950s, money that had helped send Robert to college. Robert agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. He provided family documents, photographs, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal that had been in a box of his great-grandfather's effects, unopened for decades. The journal was partially encoded, using a simple substitution cipher that a cryptologist from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey was able to break. The decoded entries were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. Blackwood wrote about his victims, not with remorse or even particular passion, but with a collector's detachment. He described Margaret Ashworth's final hours in detail that matched the forensic evidence. He had encountered her on the coastal trail, offered to show her a spectacular viewpoint known only to locals, and led her to his property on the pretext of getting equipment for a better climb. He had struck her with a piece of driftwood. He noted specifically that he always used found objects, never anything that could be traced to him, and buried her in the prepared chamber, while his neighbors believed he was sick in bed. The journal also confirmed the identities of the other women and revealed 2 additional victims, one in Chicago in 1889 and another in Denver in 1893, that Santos had not yet discovered. Each entry included details about the women's personalities, their routines, their last words. Blackwood seemed to select victims who reminded him of someone referred to only as ML, possibly a woman who had rejected or hurt him earlier in life, though the journal provided no clear identification. The discovery made national news. California's oldest cold case solved through modern DNA technology, read the headlines, though Santos knew the technology had only confirmed what old-fashioned detective work had uncovered. The story sparked renewed interest in other historical disappearances, and Santos received dozens of inquiries from families wondering if their own ancestral mysteries might finally be solved. On a foggy morning in November 2019, a memorial service was held in Cypress Point for all of Blackwood's known victims. Sarah Ashworth Collins had flown in from Philadelphia, joined by descendants of Emma Morrison and Alice Reardon. Catherine Norris had no living descendants, but a representative from the Reno hospital where she had worked attended on behalf of the institution. Robert Blackwood also came, struggling with the weight of his ancestors' crimes, but feeling it necessary to bear witness. The service was held at the same cliff where Margaret had last been seen alive. Reverend Patricia Williams of the Cypress Point Congregational Church read from Ecclesiastes about there being a season for all things, a time to lose and a time to seek, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Sarah Ashworth Collins spoke about her great-great-aunt's love of teaching, her adventurous spirit that had brought her west when such journeys were still uncommon for women traveling alone. She read from one of Margaret's letters home, written just days before her death. I feel as though I am discovering not just new landscapes, but new parts of myself. The woman who returns to Boston will not be the same one who left. Detective Santos attended, but stood apart from the group, watching the morning mist roll across the Pacific. She thought about the strange persistence of truth, how it could lie buried for more than a century, yet still emerge intact, demanding recognition. She thought about Margaret Ashworth's mother, Catherine, who had never stopped insisting that her daughter hadn't simply vanished, that something had been done to her. Catherine had been right, but she had died in 1918, never knowing what had happened to her youngest daughter. The town of Cypress Point faced its own reckoning. Josiah Blackwood's name appeared on several historical markers as an early benefactor. He had donated land for the first public school, contributed to the construction of the Methodist Church, and served on the town council from 1910 to 1915. The current mayor, Jennifer Martinez, appointed a committee to review all public references to Blackwood and to consider how the town should address this dark chapter of its history. The committee, which included local historians, descendants of founding families, and representatives from victim advocacy groups, met for 6 months. They ultimately recommended that Blackwood's name be removed from all honorary designations, but that a new historical marker be placed at the town museum explaining the full story, both the harm he had caused and the failure of the community and law enforcement to detect his crimes. The marker would also honor his victims and acknowledge the many women whose disappearances in the early 20th century were dismissed or forgotten. Robert Blackwood, wrestling with his ancestors' legacy, established a fund in the victims' names to support the Monterey County Cold Case Unit. He also worked with genealogists to trace any remaining descendants of the victims, offering to share what financial restitution he could from his great-grandfather's estate, though he knew no amount could truly compensate for the losses. The forensic excavation of Blackwood's property continued for several months. While no additional bodies were found, investigators discovered more evidence of his crimes, jewelry hidden in a tin box beneath the barn, including items that matched descriptions of belongings from the missing women. There were also photographs, not of the victims, but of locations where they had been taken, each carefully labeled with dates. Blackwood had been documenting his crimes while maintaining his facade as a respectable citizen. Dr. Lisa Chen, a criminal psychologist from Stanford, who consulted on the case, published a paper analyzing Blackwood's pattern of behavior. She noted that he represented a type of predator that had likely been more common than historical records suggest: intelligent, mobile, and operating in an era when women's disappearances were often attributed to voluntary departure or misadventure rather than foul play. She argued that many cold cases from the late 19th and early 20th centuries might be connected to similar traveling predators who exploited the lack of communication between jurisdictions. The case prompted California to allocate additional funding for cold case investigations, particularly those involving unidentified remains from the pre-DNA era. A team at UC Davis began developing new techniques for extracting genetic material from severely degraded samples, using Margaret Ashworth's case as a proof of concept for what they called archaeological forensics. In Boston, the school where Margaret Ashworth had taught still existed, now a community center in the same brick building where she had instructed immigrant children in reading and arithmetic. The director, learning of the solved case, created a small memorial in the building's entrance hall. They displayed a photograph of Margaret, recovered from her effects at the Seafoam Inn, alongside one of her watercolors that Sarah Ashworth Collins had donated. The painting showed the Cypress Point coastline on what must have been one of her last mornings alive. The lighthouse small but distinct on the horizon. The sea rendered in shades of blue and green that seemed to capture both its beauty and its indifference. The Seafoam Inn, which had been converted to apartments in the 1960s and then restored as a bed and breakfast in the 1990s, created a small museum room dedicated to the case. The current owners, Tom and Patricia Brennan, descendants of the lighthouse keeper who had been the last person to see Margaret alive, displayed reproductions of newspaper articles, photographs, and a timeline of the investigation. They reported that bookings had increased significantly since the case was solved, though they tried to maintain a respectful tone about what they called dark tourism. Detective Santos received numerous awards for her work on the case, but she remained focused on the dozens of other cold cases in her files. In interviews, she emphasized that solving Margaret Ashworth's murder had required not just modern technology, but also traditional detective work, historical research, and perhaps most importantly, the decision not to give up on cases simply because they were old. "Every victim deserves justice," she said, "even if it comes a century late." The case also had an unexpected effect on genealogical research. Dozens of families began investigating their own ancestors who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leading to the creation of an online database specifically for pre-1950 missing persons cases. Within a year, the database had logged over 3,000 cases, many of them women who had vanished while traveling, working, or living alone. Patterns that suggested they might have encountered predators, like Blackwood. One of the most poignant discoveries came from the journal of Eleanor Hartley, the Seafoam Inn proprietress, which was found in the Monterey County Historical Society archives. In an entry dated months after Margaret's disappearance, she had written, "I cannot shake the feeling that we failed Miss Ashworth somehow. She came here, seeking health and peace, trusting in our hospitality, and we couldn't keep her safe. I see her still sometimes, in the corner of my eye, sitting in the garden with her paints, trying to capture the light. Perhaps that is all any of us can do. Try to capture what light we can before the darkness finds us." As the second anniversary of the discovery approached, Cypress Point held a conference on cold case investigations, bringing together law enforcement, forensic scientists, and historians from across the country. The keynote speaker was Sarah Ashworth Collins, who had become an advocate for cold case funding. She spoke about the importance of remembering the forgotten, of refusing to let time erase injustice. She ended her speech with a quote from one of Margaret's letters, written during her train journey to California. "I am traveling towards something I cannot yet name, some understanding that awaits me at the continent's edge. Whatever I find there, I trust it will be worth the journey." The conference concluded with a candlelight vigil at sunset. Participants walked the same coastal trail where Margaret had last been seen, ending at a new memorial that had been erected, not just for her, but for all of Blackwood's victims. The memorial was a simple stone bench facing the ocean, inscribed with names and dates, and a line from Shakespeare, "Truth will come to light. Murder cannot be hid long." Detective Santos stood at the memorial as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She thought about Margaret Ashworth, young and talented, who had traveled 3,000 miles seeking restoration and found instead a predator who had learned to hide in plain sight. She thought about the other women, their stories only partially recovered, their families long gone. And she thought about the cases still unsolved in her files, the victims still waiting for someone to piece together the fragments of their final days. A reporter asked her if solving such an old case really mattered, given that everyone directly involved was long dead. Santos considered the question, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. "Justice isn't just for the living," she said finally. "It's a promise we make as a society, that we will remember, that we will seek truth, that we won't allow killers to win simply by outlasting their victims." Margaret Ashworth deserved to have her story told, her fate known, her killer named. That matters, whether it takes a year or a century. As darkness fell and the vigil participants dispersed, Santos remained at the memorial. She had received a call that morning about another set of remains found during construction, this time in San Luis Obispo County. The bones were old, the circumstances suspicious. Tomorrow she would begin again, sifting through records, tracing patterns, refusing to let time be the final arbiter of justice. The Ashworth case had taught her that the past was never truly past, that it lay just beneath the surface, patient and persistent, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it. In her office, she had pinned Margaret's photograph next to a map of California, marked with dots representing unsolved historical disappearances. There were dozens of them, each a story interrupted, a truth buried. The work would continue, one case at a time, one name at a time, pulling the forgotten back into the light. Because that was what justice meant in the end. Not just solving crimes, but insisting that every life mattered enough to be remembered correctly, every death mattered enough to be explained, and every truth mattered enough to be uncovered, no matter how many years had passed. In the weeks following the memorial, several important developments occurred. The California state legislature passed Margaret's Law, which allocated permanent funding for cold case units in every county and mandated DNA collection from all unidentified remains, regardless of age. The National Museum of Crime and Justice in Washington, D.C., created an exhibit on the Ashworth case, focusing on how it illustrated the evolution of forensic science and the importance of preserving evidence even when cases seem unsolvable. Perhaps most significantly, Robert Blackwood made a decision that surprised everyone. He donated his great-grandfather's farm, now valued at several $1 million due to coastal development, to create the Blackwood Victims Memorial Park. The park would include walking trails, educational panels about the history of violence against women, and a research center dedicated to solving cold cases. At the dedication ceremony, he spoke briefly but powerfully. We can't choose our ancestors, but we can choose how we respond to their legacy. My great-grandfather took lives and buried truth. I want to dedicate my life to recovering what was lost and ensuring it never happens again. The story of Margaret Ashworth's murder and its solution after 117 years became a touchstone for discussions about justice, memory, and the responsibilities we bear toward the forgotten dead. It reminded people that beneath the carefully maintained surfaces of respectable communities, darkness could hide for generations. But it also demonstrated that truth, like the bones themselves, had a way of eventually surfacing, demanding acknowledgement and action from those willing to look closely enough to see it.